We were going to start tonight with a discussion of World War II and the Great Migration. One of the striking things, I mean, there are two things to think about. One thing to think about the Great Migration, we typically see migrations, whether they're of blacks from the south to north, or the so-called crisis at our southern border, or whatever, as this kind of push thing that people are coming, that hordes are descending, and that it's this kind of uncontrolled activity, and they just happen to be coming, which is very unfortunate. But the basic fact is that without a pull, there's never going to be a push. So a major cause of the Great Migration was were the wars, and especially the need for labor in the North, which was much more heavily industrialized and needed to produce for the war effort at a time when many men went to serve overseas. And in general, the sort of mythology of American capitalism and the hope that it holds out to people who feel themselves to be oppressed and often were also political refugees is significant in exerting a pull. So migration is not this kind of random, archaic, anarchic process. We always have to consider the whole. What about soldiers fighting in World Wars I and II? There were a small number of Black soldiers who actually served in overseas in the war because of racism during World War I. But there were about 1.5 million Black soldiers who served, most of them in combat in World War II. So the number was very significant. So how does that relate to today or recent events over the last couple of years? I'll give you a hint. Black football players taking a knee during the Star-Spangled Banner and the display of the flag. What does opposition to that say? Given that it was very controversial and Colin Kaepernick still hasn't found a job as a quarterback, even though he's clearly more capable than certainly most backup quarterbacks.
Oh, wow.
And is a very talented starting quarterback.
So is there a perception that they're unpatriotic? Mm-hmm. Is that what the...
Mm-hmm. Right, they're dishonoring the flag which Americans fought and died for their freedom, and look at how they're misusing it. So that response, pure and simple, is just profoundly racist. It assumes that the Americans who fought were white, and we have these ungrateful, uppity blacks who are now dishonoring everything. So it assumes, that there were no blacks who fought. It assumes that the blacks who fought were unrelated to the football players. It assumes that the football players are. Colin Kaepernick actually has a really good video. I think it's on YouTube, which sort of depicts athletes as slaves. So in some sense, although they're well paid, they're essentially treated as if they're owned. And they certainly have measurable value. Value may be high, but we typically focus on the value, the salaries that athletes make, and not on the income that the owners make, which is, you know, enormous. So there's this kind of us white people and them who really don't belong, and now they're dishonoring our flag and dishonoring our service as if it was only white people who died. So that's extremely racist. And it was, you know, a couple of years ago when black athletes were taking knees instead of standing was very, very predominant.
It seemed to me, though, that that was just a spin that was put on it, that it was being disrespectful to the flag because it was uncomfortable to say they're making a statement about race. I don't think the owners or maybe even the fans really wanted to open that. So it was just, it was more convenient, and it seemed like it was more damaging to them to say they were being disrespectful to the flag, because we can all jump on that. We don't want to disrespect the flag. So I think it was just easier to say that.
Well, the face of modern racism is that it's easier to say something else. That doesn't make it any less racist.
No, it distracts from it, though.
But I think just following that thought through, it's definitely a way of changing the narrative, right? As opposed to talking about why they're doing it, we're just talking about the fact that, right, they're anti-patriotic. It's just, it's a way of deferring the blame.
It totally changes the narrative because the reason that they're doing it was very blatant and very put out there. They made it very clear why they were doing it. And then the unpatriotic thing just simply is a subterfuge that dodges the issue.
All right.
Whatever the conversation is about what Kaepernick did, taking the knee, I did appreciate the action, and because it created a conversation in our nation on what we are all about. And I believe the goodness of the people of this country still shows the resolve and the humanity of the people that are in this country, because we are open to discussion, we are open to listening to one another, which is also what we're doing now. So it does open a lot of things. So thank you, guys.
Mm-hmm.
I have one question before we go on. There was a reference to the fact that not everyone was awarded or became eligible for GI Bill.
Well,
Do you know when that changed? Has it changed?
no, I don't. I suspect it should have changed, but I don't actually know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I can speak a little bit about that since I'm a retired military. It did change. It did change. I believe in the early or late 70s when our servicemen or service members, I would say, end up contributing a small amount of money for the fund when they leave the service, and that money that they contribute will go to their educational benefit. Way back then, if you joined the service or the military before 1974 or during 74, 75, you are qualified to receive a GI Bill benefit. Okay, so that's all I can say about it.
Okay. Thanks, Eddie. So moving on to chapter 8, were there any comments, thoughts, reactions?
I thought the comparison of Martin Luther King and Billy Graham was interesting. I I really don't know anything about Billy Graham other than I think he's, I guess I thought he was on the TV, and I know he was quite famous and he would go around, but I think just in my time while I was growing up, he didn't have any meaning to me at all.
Uh-huh. He doesn't have a great deal of meaning to very many Catholics, but he
I was
was.
raised Protestant though, and I
Oh,
don't,
oh,
yeah,
really? What denomination?
Moravian.
Oh,
It's I think like an early form of Lutheran, maybe. um,
yeah.
but
Oh, so Moravian as in the Czech lands, right? Yeah, Lutheran. Yeah, but yeah, his appeal is, I mean, his appeal was, in terms of Protestantism, is really to, the Baptist, and he was a Baptist, and so his appeal was really to predominantly to Baptist and post-Baptist religions. So he was certainly not very appealing to Lutherans and Lutheran, any liturgical religion. And he was not really wasn't very appealing to the Reformed churches. And then after that, like in terms of Methodism and Presbyterianism, it becomes very partial. So the real appeal is to Baptist and post-Baptist churches. And then, of course, for Catholicism, very little awareness at all.
okay.
I thought it was interesting how many different little topics were covered during this period. And
Mhm.
it made me think, what we discussed when we first talked about the pros and cons of the way Tisby approached this, and just the fact that his approach is very surface, because there are a few things that I really wish that he had talked more about.
Uh-huh.
Like the rise of the Black Power movement, I thought the paragraph ended and, and that was all we heard about that.
Uh-huh. Right. That's in some ways maybe one place to start. So in the Black Power movement, we have in many ways sort of many alternatives to Christianity. And so one of them was the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X, and then Louis Farrakhan, who is alive today and now the head of the Nation of Islam. We had the rise of the Black Panther Party, which in some areas in Oakland and in Chicago was a very real and vibrant presence. I knew the leader of the Chicago Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton, was murdered about 6 weeks after I met him. He was drugged and murdered. He was drugged and murdered in his sleep by a combined task force of the FBI and the Chicago police. And so for many of those alternative movements, the criticism of Christianity is that it is the ideology of the oppressors. So that's a good question for discussion. So the question is, Tisby argues that the complicity of Christianity with racism has given rise to the perception that Christianity is the religion of the oppressors, and has given rise to alternative movements such as the Nation of Islam. Do you agree with this argument? Is it still true? And are there other ways in which American Christianity can be seen as the religion of the oppressors.
Even Billy Graham, he did some things like take down the ropes that separated blacks from whites at his, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah,
And but
revival meetings.
right, yeah. But then you know, he wouldn't go to the South when the civil rights movement was there. He just stayed out of it, and he said that, you know, it's a one-on-one thing. You know, you evangelize people one at a time. He wasn't going to take a public stance against it.
Right. You know, let's sort of defer discussion of that to a later
Okay.
point, since that's really important. But how about this question? As followers of Christ, we're called to imitate Christ. And the sad thing is that non-Christians tend to believe in or expect Christians to imitate Christ far more than Christians expect Christians to imitate Christ. So when non-Christians see something that to them appears to not be an imitation of Christ, it leads them to distrust Christianity and ultimately leads to a rejection of Christianity. So we see that in the civil rights movement. Did anyone read a letter from Birmingham jail?
Mhm.
Not entirely.
So Martin Luther King basically argues that he sees moderate Christians as a bigger enemy than white supremacists and the Ku Klux Klan,
Mhm.
because they, sort of seem to be supporters. They present logical arguments, and yet they do nothing and are really on the opposite side. So even he had this sense of frustration with Christianity, with Christians. So where do we see it today?
I was thinking about how segregated denominations seem to be.
Mhm.
In our own parish, not very much diversity. And it kind of made me think that about in the beginning, slaves becoming Christian because that was the religion of the owner. In that respect, definitely makes it feel like religion of the oppressor. And in many cases, I would see that further generations would want to reject that, as that's what they would see as just another thing that was held over from when slavery, when their families, their race was owned, and in their own advancement, you would want to reject all the things from the past. So that's what made me think, oh, well, they just took the parts, I don't know, of Baptist, for example, take all the parts that they connected to, but they made it into their own Black church. So in that sense, it seems to me still perpetuated.
So racism persists in the church. Are there other ways in which the church is oppressive?
Well, I think the way he talks about it in the book is by their silence. And maybe that still can be true.
Mhm. Yeah. So, well, I mean, he talks about it both as silence and vocal opposition.
Mhm.
He does note vocal opposition, whatever his name was, Gillespie. And he quotes
Oh, right.
his document at length. That was, a very vocal opposition.
Mhm.
So we see racism, I think both, although it's, redefined to look nice, we see both vocal racism and acquiescence today. Do we see it in other areas in the church? How about attitudes toward the LGBTQ community? The church's sex abuse scandal has also never been really completely uncovered and repented of. That certainly was oppressive.
Yeah, it seems like within the Catholic Church, I'm not sure about other churches, there seems to be these rules that you must follow or you're not invited or supposed to be taking communion. And I don't, is that still true for LGBT people? Are they not supposed to take communion?
I don't actually know, but I suspect not. Do you know, Susan?
I don't. I think it depends on the priest.
Yeah.
I also found it interesting when they talked about the answer to desegregation of schools in the South was to create private schools.
Mhm.
And when we were stationed in Montgomery, Alabama, everybody who was there in the military sent their kids to the private schools because they were better, right?
Yeah.
And so in retrospect, I find it so interesting that still pervades, right? And in a city that's very diverse. But my son went to a Catholic school and it was all white children and
Mhm.
just definitely such a holdover from that.
That that sort of movement still persists and is also morphed into the homeschooling movement. And the motivation behind it is that you don't want your children corrupted by secular society and whatever. So so the view there is that non-Christians are a kind of contagion that are going to corrupt you.
Mhm.
And the problem with that if you're a follower of Christ, which we either profess to be or pretend we are, you have to believe that the holy makes the unholy holy. The clean makes the unclean clean. That's what being a disciple of Christ means, that we should be able to transform the unholy into the holy. If our view is that we'll be contaminated, then we're not disciples of Christ, pure and simple.
Interesting. Yeah.
We're not following the teaching of Christ. We're not following the mission of Christ. And then the related to that, and so there's been, besides the homeschool movement in private Christian schools, there's also been the birth of Bible schools and Christian universities, and I don't mean by Christian universities, like the Catholic universities, which are real universities. But, I mean like Bible schools and like Liberty University, which
Right.
was, and, in terms of academic credentials, in terms of, the academic standards, they're a joke. They're they're institutes of propaganda and brainwashing.
Mhm.
And so the irony is that if you go to a secular school, they'll brainwash you. The reality is that that's where the brainwashing occurs in Christian, so-called Christian schools.
Mhm.
If I may make a comment about what Susan just shared.
Uh-huh.
Thank you, Susan, for sharing that, because it took me back to way back in my grade school and high school years, where I was enrolled in private Catholic schools. And somehow I can relate to what Susan just said about the pervasiveness of, although I cannot call it as an institution that contributes to racism, but I may call it as being elite or elitism, or being
Yeah.
elite.
El-
Somehow it gives
Elitism.
aura that you are on this level and the rest are on the down level.
Yeah.
Although the schools, the Catholic schools, are teaching us the teachings of Jesus Christ, that we are all equal, but in practice, looking back, it makes me feel guilty that it wasn't really there. I didn't really see that.
Mm-hmm.
And I relate to
Yeah.
what you just said, Ron, that it does contribute to something that is not pleasant, should I say.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway,
Right.
that's all. That's
Yeah.
all. I just wanted to relate to what Susan just said.
Yeah. Thank you, Eddie. So earlier we had kind of touched upon Billy Graham and sort of moderation. So I thought that was worth discuss the contrast between the activism of the civil rights movement and the moderate view that social change is best accomplished through personal conversion. Do we observe the same contrast in the church today?
Yeah, I feel like when this became a bigger topic with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, there was so much willingness to read about it and, try to educate oneself, but so little desire to make a difference or change or, work to fix this situation, right? There's just a
Right.
lot of discussion about, well, we just have to start with ourselves and make ourselves better, and eventually it will all be better.
Right.
But obviously
Right.
that's not enough.
Yeah. So we've been we've been trying to talk about this, or more really, probably more hinting at it than explicitly, confronting it. But we've been talking about the theology of salvation, that we're that the goal is our individual salvation, and so presumably salvation leads to good behavior. But the problem is that our sense of good behavior as it's generally often taught by our faith, and certainly less so in the Catholic tradition and less so in sort of the traditional, the older um, denominational traditions, and much more so in fundamental evangelical fundamentalism, the expressions of faith are very sort of limited. You kind of presumably shouldn't smoke, definitely shouldn't drink, because that's bad. Um, probably not be violent, although I think that's kind of optional because our Second Amendment rights are critically important. So exactly what Christian behavior looks like is, sort of confined to a limited sphere of individual behavior and rarely spills over into interpersonal behavior. So maybe you shouldn't bully people, and maybe, gossiping and abusing people isn't the best thing to do, but that's a very narrow sphere, and it doesn't really affect society as a whole. And so, Christians have been behaving like that in America since its foundation. And yet here we are. Last week, so I argued that American history can only be periodized as a single period, which means we're fundamentally in the same place we were when we started, despite enormous change, despite urbanization, despite industrialization, despite the transformation of the rise of capitalism and the transformation of free market capitalism to monopoly capitalism. Despite those enormous changes, we're in fundamentally the same place that we were 200 years ago, which is not exactly high praise. So, so this notion that if that personal conversion accomplishes something is fundamentally flawed.
And that contributes to the more pervasive individualism that seems to be, well, it's my right, not there's a common right.
Right, right. Exactly, yeah, right. If the focus is on individual conversion, then the focus is also on my individual relationship with Christ. That's a really big thing in evangelical circles, particularly. I mean, there's a major school of thought that it's all about relationships. So what matters is my relationship with Jesus, and also what the Holy Spirit tells me about the Bible
Yeah.
in my readings for today. So that means that there can be as many interpretations of the Bible as there are people, and that interpretations can be diametrically opposed, but it's coming from the Holy Spirit, so that's okay. Have we seen it in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, other than through a an expression of curiosity that is limited? As Susan was saying, have we seen opposition?
Well, the most common response to people who object to it is all lives matter.
Right,
It's just
right.
frustrating.
Uh-huh. what else? Does everyone understand how all lives matter is an inappropriate response? There was also a major issue was should the church relate to the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah.
And so there was, this hair splitting about not the organization, but, the broader movement and whatever. And, the need to do that at all, is born from a basic insecurity and a basic hostility toward the movement in general. And then there was also a great deal of upset about the violence that sometimes happened during demonstrations, although if we look at it, overall, the violence was comparatively rare and fairly isolated. For many, that was a real turnoff, and there shouldn't be any violence. Which reminds me, one of the most common responses that I heard in muted opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement is that we should pray for peace. So that's the next question. One of the sardonic comments about Billy Graham's refusal to take a more active role in opposing racism is that he's too busy praying. Is this a fair comment? Is it applicable to us in our own time?
I think so. I think there's a great deal of response to encouraging priests to address this issue from the pulpit. I think kind of a common response on that side was trying not to be political, right? Perceiving it as talking about equity and justice was taking a political stance. And,
right.
Yeah.
Going back to our previous discussion, that position ultimately reflects the position that that our faith is about change, is about personal conversion and personal improvement. So if we improve somehow, presumably ethically and morally, if we, sort of don't commit if we don't sin within a limited sphere, then change will happen. And we should pray. And indeed, we should pray. But the problem is prayer adequate?
No. In kind of to loop back to one of the things that Susan said, the school district that I work for at the time of all the riots and protests and back and forth, and I think they were working on equity and diversity for a number of years, but it kind of came to a head, and so there were some suggestions and book studies, I guess you could call them. They wanted everybody to read these particular books, and how do you talk to kids about the things that were happening and all. And on a very cerebral level, I was devouring this and yes, praying. And this group has really challenged me. And thank you, Susan, for sending us some links for action. I think my personal conversion has now come to, all right, that's not enough. I really need to act. So it was kind of a movement from the cerebral, from the personal to now what?
Mhm.
Now I need to act. That's sort of been my Lenten thing.
Well, that's good. That's very
less,
good.
less me and more others.
Uh-huh. That's
Yeah.
extremely good.
We're called to do, yeah.
Yeah. So what I've witnessed very frequently, is that, there's kind of when I was an evangelical, there was kind of a joke that a number of pastors, um, a standard phrase that a number of pastors repeated, it's that when they ask somebody to do something and they say, well, I'll pray about it, the answer actually is no, I refuse to do that because it's beneath me,
Yeah.
right? I'm not
My
willing
way
to.
of saying no.
Yeah, it's a religious way of saying no. And, and it strikes me that often prayer is used in that way,
Yeah.
in which case, when prayer is used as an excuse for doing something,
Mhm.
then prayer itself becomes sinful.
Hmm.
And that, is very problematic. You're praying to God as an excuse for something you should be taking responsibility for and doing, and putting it on God to do something instead.
Hmm.
So that's so James.
One of
Oh,
my friends always prays for God's will to be done. And often God's will is hitting me on the top of the head like, okay, get going.
Mm.
right, right. I mean, God acts through people.
Hmm.
And so it ultimately is we as disciples of Christ who are called to act.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in some areas, obviously, we can only ask for God's intervention. If we're praying for someone who has cancer, for example, we can't go and take care of it. I mean, in many spheres, prayer is important. Prayer is the only weapon that we have, but in others, that's not the case. So, for example, James says in chapter 2, verse 14, what does it profit, my brethren, if a man says he has faith but has not works? Can his faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and in lack of daily food, one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body. What does it profit? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. And so we can extend that to prayer instead of, we pray that there be peace. But there's really a simple formula. If you want peace, work for justice. That's a sort of motto of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. Where there's no justice, there can be no peace. The lack of justice produces violence. Violence is a response to the lack of justice. So praying doesn't affect that. And God is not going to, use thunderbolts and things of that sort to bring about justice. God can, but is unlikely to succeed and touching the hearts of the wicked, because that is a denial of free will. Ultimately, we're responsible for what we do. So prayer becomes an excuse. Very closely related is another question. The civil rights movement is often romanticized in our memories, but in reality, many Christian churches did not support the protesters. Where do you see the church being equally silent as you consider movements for justice today? So we've talked about some of them. Racism is very, very clear. A separation between the spiritual and the political is very clear and very problematic. The continued demonization of LGBTQ people is very problematic.
But social justice shouldn't be political. I remember in high school, I went to a very integrated high school in Yakima, Davis, and the Black kids around, in our classes were starting a Black student union. And so somehow, of course, my memory's foggy on a lot of this, and some of the pictures made it to the annual. They were going to have a march around the building. And so we were told not to be there, just let them do it. Well, no, we all wanted to be there. We all wanted to support them. These were people we went to school with and all that. And so we weren't going to be passive. And my mom worked in the library at the time, and there's no way she would have let us stay home. No, we're going. And most everybody I knew did. So we were right there with them. We were supposed to, if we were in the building, go into your classrooms, get out of the hallways. Like, no, we were out there with them. But, I can't say it went any further than that. But, in Yakima, they did student exchange things, and they sent the Black kids to Eisenhower, and then the white kids came to Davis, and then most of the white kids stayed if their parents would let them. But a lot of them weren't able to stay because they were told, we don't want that on your transcript. You won't get into Stanford, even though they were happier. But none of the Black kids wanted to go, wanted to stay away. They all came back. So it was a really nice memory for me. High school wasn't the usual,
Right.
what your father does and blah, 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 and all that. So,
yeah.
But, and now every school, at my last reunion, the new principal, young guy, took us all the way through, and the entire city of Yakima has free lunch, breakfast and lunch for all students in the entire district. So there's no stigmatizing kids who need it. It is just free. And at the Catholic Church, I also did a thing at my old parish, St. Paul's, and we went to Mass, and they were talking about Friday nights religious ed, and they asked people to bring food. We want to feed these kids. Everybody who comes is going to be fed. Because there it is. If they do it Friday night, then at least they're going into the weekend fed.
Yeah.
Ron, I everyone, going back to this question that you posed, the civil rights movement is often romanticized in our memories. I have to look at it from from decades or perhaps centuries, from the limited knowledge that I have about missionaries that went overseas and dedicated Christians as well as Catholic priests that went on a mission to work on justice. And in fact, today is March 24th, which is the anniversary of, I believe, Bishop Romero from El Salvador, who was assassinated this day.
Right.
He is an advocate, a very strong advocate for justice.
Yes, he was.
He was assassinated.
Saint
So
Oscar
I beg to
Jemar.
differ that we do have people, human beings, who, in their own quiet way, were strong advocates for the movements of justice. Maybe not today,
Mhm.
but decades ago, centuries ago, and I think even today. I'm sorry, but even today, they're there. We are there, and you guys are here. You guys
Right.
are the ones who are advocating this. I'm
Mhm.
proud of you. I'm with you guys. Thank you.
Yeah. No, you're quite correct, Eddie. I mean, there have always been activists. There have always been proponents for justice. There have always, can always, and in many ways, they've abounded within Catholicism. But the hard thing is that there have been too few, despite sort of very many and very many great examples. That there have been too few, and today we're as a faith very very divided. Um, and so it's striking, that Martin Luther King has become kind of an icon, and so everybody from extreme conservatives who are very openly racist to uh, everyone at the other end of the spectrum can quote him with, sort of fond recollections, so that he's been sanitized. That, that process, if we look at it, can anyone think of someone else who's been sanitized?
Ron, and if I may add, I have to confess that I have not read the book into its entirety.
Uh-huh.
I may have missed a lot of the discussion points here, so sorry.
So that's okay. No, I mean, what you said was very relevant. And, it's always, you should always remember that there's that stream of resistance of people who have done the right thing, regardless of what it's cost them. But in terms of the sanitization, can you think of anyone else who's been sanitized? I can think of one really, really major case of sanitization.
In the
I don't
world,
know that much. I don't know that much about Gandhi, but similarly, when you were talking about quotes of Martin Luther King, I was thinking, well, there's the quotes that everybody knows from Mahatma Gandhi, but he was very controversial.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. He's been sanitized. But as Christians, there's a sanitization that is much more relevant to us.
Christ.
Christ.
Yeah.
Jesus has been sanitized. He's a nice guy. He's our best friend. He's, in fact, for many people, an imaginary friend, because they've created an image of Jesus of their own.
Yeah.
The parables were meant to be disturbing. If you look at each parable, it should literally make you sick. It should rock your world, and it still should. And instead, they're all nice little stories. The parable of the Good Samaritan is about how we should be nice to one another. On the
Yeah,
one
it's too
hand,
bad somebody doesn't rewrite in, I don't know, some other not very complimentary way of to
it
convert it into a more present day parable that would, like you said, rock
It
the
wouldn't,
meaning.
I don't think it would make a difference. 'Cause it would, sort of end up being interpreted in kind of the same way is the problem. I mean, the harshness is still there, if you sort of think about it. So the parable of the Samaritan, I mean, we should be nice to one another, but that isn't what the parable is about. That isn't Jesus' concern. If we look at any, the starting point for each parable is what here is disturbing, and we can find that. But if we start with the mindset that this is a nice story, or if we start with the sort of mindset that this is kind of a nice reading or whatever, we miss it. Similarly, when we pray the Lord's Prayer, in the patristic tradition, the Lord's Prayer is a complete set of contradictions. Our Father who art in heaven. How can Father and heaven be compatible? They're in contradiction. And then, there's a long analysis of why they're in contradiction. But the point is that all of this has been lost and all of this has been anesthetized. And so the Lord's Prayer is, this nice prayer that Jesus taught us how to pray. But like everything else, it's supposed to call us to question ourselves and to call us to question our knowledge of God and to call us to question our relationship with God, to call us to question who we are and whether we're engaged in self-deception. That's also the purpose of the creed. And instead of that, there are these things we repeat. One, because the creed is old, and two, because that's how Jesus taught us to pray, as if a rote formula can accomplish something. As if we believe in magic, which we don't. And so there's this sanitization. And sanitization is an opponent of discipleship. But it occurs to me, I'm really talking way too much. Again, for which I apologize. It's a sort of an inborn, it's not an inborn trait, it's an acquired trait since I've begun teaching.
We appreciate all the wisdom that you have to share on this, Ron.
Oh, thank you. We've kind of been hinting about kind of images of Christianity, and Tisby discusses, one of the images. Does everybody remember head of Christ? I mean, does everyone remember what it looks like? It's
Oh,
probably the most,
Yeah.
that's it, it's probably the most familiar painting of Christ that we know.
Mhm.
Tisby argues that he uses Solomons, the head of Christ, to argue that Jesus Christ was a European-looking white man, and many added to that assumption that he was a free market capitalist supporting American as well. Assess the accuracy of that statement and how it's affected our view of Jesus and Christianity.
So if he's just one of us, we're not to aspire to be more like him.
Yeah, I think, I think that may well be, sort of one of the things that it does. I think it has, I mean, at one level, we discussed earlier when we were talking about Christian art in one of our previous readings, that there's nothing inherently wrong with, depicting someone in a form that culturally is familiar to people who are being reached, that the danger arises when that image hardens into a general perception. So a lot of people when seeing, say, a black Jesus are outraged because Jesus wasn't black. So one of them, so I think one thing, it makes Jesus just like us, and so he's not as demanding. And so Jesus' teachings on discipleship kind of go out the window. What are other things?
Well, I think it makes us feel like he's on our side, right? He's part of our team.
Uh-huh. Right. Yeah.
Does it make us need to get to know other people that are different? Because
Uh-huh.
Jesus is right.
Yeah. That's that's good. He's part of our team.
Well, that goes to the Civil War as well, because they were, God was on their side. Well, how could God be on both sides?
Right. Actually, yeah. I mean, that's very true. He's, God is on our side. He's on our team. Yay, God. We've got God. Takes care of everything.
And therefore, when I'm being capitalistic and maybe in some ways oppressive because I want to make the almighty buck, again, God's on my side.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So I can exploit you because, yeah.
Right.
And I think it creates a lack of a need to empathize with anyone who's different.
Right. Yeah. Very definitely. The Savior looks like us. It's also, so most strikingly, Jesus was a Jew. And first of all, it's explicitly anti-Semitic. It's extremely anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism really continues to be a problem within Christianity, and especially within evangelical fundamentalism. Although evangelical fundamentalists tend to be really major, rabid supporters of Israel.
Yeah.
They support Israel because presumably the restoration of Israel was, prophesied in the book of Revelation and by Paul. And before Jesus can come, the temple in Jerusalem has to be rebuilt and animal sacrifice resumed. So that has to happen so that Jesus can come again. So therefore, you have to support Israel, even though, despite anti-Semitism. And then the second thing is that it really cuts us off from the Jewish tradition. And a significant part of Christian, if we look at Jesus' teaching, he fundamentally transforms the Mosaic law, transforms Judaism, very much is based on Judaism and yet transforms Judaism, transforms the Mosaic law. And all of that gets missed. And so an important part of the tradition that links us back to Jesus and that links us to the tradition of the fathers who recognize that gets lost. So Catholicism should represent the faith the fathers handed down. And it increasingly, especially in America, in Western Europe, is increasingly less and less connected to the faith that's been handed down. Can anyone see the connection to free market capitalists supporting American as well? I myself, that's true. And yet I don't quite see the connection. At one point in one of the churches we attended, Vanessa and I were asked to attempt to kind of revive the bookstore in the church, which had gotten dated, and I was going through all of these horrible books, and one of them was a book about how capitalism was a God-sanctioned system and was the perfect economic system that reflected the divine will. So here we have it. Jesus was a free market capitalist supporting America. And I even partly read the book, which was a piece of kind of sort of intellectual tradition that I kind of refer to as Christian obscurantism. It's complete non sequiturs, and so I've always been mystified by how you get there, but many Americans indeed get there.
The
But nobody-
philosophy of abundance. Those who
Yeah.
have more will be given. So they have that.
Right. But
Well,
yeah,
there are those, I don't know if you want to call them schemes or not, but those businesses that, well, if you just get more people on your team and, the pyramid schemes.
right, pyramid schemes, yeah.
Well, this seems to support that whole idea of, I can't think of what it's called, but it's the prosperity. It's for those who believe the more prosperous you are, it's because God has chosen you to be more prosperous, and
Mm-hmm.
It's a good thing.
Yeah. It's
A
good
bit of a
thing.
stretch probably though to say that God was also a free market capitalist, but it would make it okay if I was then.
Right, right. Yeah, actually, I think the connection with the prosperity gospel, and also there's a view that the political and economic system is sanctioned by God. Our political leaders are, sort of anointed by God.
Yeah.
And so, there's a way in which if it exists, it must be okay with God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is interesting. I guess here it's the president is the hand on the Bible, isn't it, when he takes his oath?
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. And for some people, there's always, an attempt to determine which candidate is God's candidate.
Yeah.
Well, and how long is our money said in God we trust? And
Yeah,
it's right there on the dollar.
right.
Right. Yeah. Actually, Do you know how long it said "In God We Trust"?
No idea. To you? I
I
Google
think
it.
it's fairly recent. I mean, fairly recent.
Really? At one time, that wasn't what was on a dollar bill?
No, at one time it was not. It was added in 1957.
That is pretty recent.
And actually, I remember reading about it. It was added um, under Eisenhower as kind of a part of a propaganda campaign to counter New Deal liberals, since Roosevelt in his New Deal had kind of sort of drawn on traditional biblical images of Moses and leading his
Huh.
people out of bondage in Egypt to the promised land. And so the New Deal was likened to that. And so Roosevelt tended to draw on religious Judeo-Christian imagery very, very frequently. And so this was part of the kind of godly nation conservative attempt to counter that while discrediting the New Deal, while beginning to discredit the New Deal. Ultimate discrediting was so it was really part of the kind of godly nation mythology, or the beginning of the godly nation mythology that well, America is a godly nation.
Well, that would be our Pledge of Allegiance too. In school. And
Right, one nation under God.
yeah.
Right. Uh-huh. Yeah, the godly nation thing is really interesting because there's this view that America has drifted away from being a godly nation
Mhm.
among many Catholics and a lot of evangelicals. The interesting, so the first problem is obviously, is there a godly nation? I mean, we're not a theocracy, so many of the sort of uh, statements in the Bible about political Israel don't apply because we're not a theocracy. But there's considerable disagreement about why we're not a godly nation. So some people think that because of Roe versus Wade and abortion, we're not a godly nation.
Mhm.
Others think that the passage of the Civil Rights Act uh, moved us across the pale so that we're not a godly nation.
Right.
So that's just flat out explicitly racist on top of the other sort of theological problems of what is a godly nation. Then, well, Brown versus Board of Education is another thing cited as moving us away from being a godly nation. Another real biggie is the removal of prayer from schools.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a really kind of interesting one. If we read the Supreme Court decision, prayer in fact is allowed in school and as a voluntary activity of voluntary organizations. What's not allowed is compulsory prayer by the school administration. So this notion that you can't pray in school, and has been removed from school, is a lie. And it's a lie that has is really used to kind of whip people up
Yeah.
and get emotions high. When in fact, I think we discussed this last week, but prayer doesn't belong in school. as a compulsory activity.
Hmm.
There's no reason to force non-Christians, to force atheists, to force agnostics to pray. And as Catholics, we also should be wary of compulsory prayer. So, for example, if we're praying Our Father, which version do we pray? Protestant one or the Catholic one?
Mhm.
Where prayer reflects theology, what happens when it doesn't reflect Catholic theology? But we're out of time, and I've continued to talk too much. So next week we'll do chapter 9,
Mhm.
Mhm.
organizing the religious right at the end of the 20th century. So we're moving into our own time.
I may share some of my closing thoughts. Is anybody here remember the film, the Song of Bernadette?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And who is this star?
Yeah.
Jennifer Jones, right? You must be my age.
Hollywood star. Yeah.
Anyway,
Maybe.
there was on the opening film, there was something that caught my profound attention. It says, "For those who believe in God, no explanation is necessary. For those who do not believe in God, no explanation is possible." You remember that?
Yeah.
So I just
Yeah.
want to close. I just want to share that thought with you guys.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.